Who would have known that a seemingly innocuous piece of background art in Teslagrad would represent the entire driving force behind its sequel? Greetings, Teslamancers, this is Borsenberger. If you watched my previous video covering the Lore of Teslagrad, then you knew this was coming. It's time to analyze the lore of Teslagrad 2. In my previous lore video on Teslagrad 1, I had constructed a rough timeline of events that happened before the game and events that happened during the game. The timeline of Teslagrad 2 brings its own backstory, part of which includes the history from Teslagrad 1, as well as events that happened before and after World to the West. All of these events will be combined to make a richer, more complete timeline. The backstory elements in Teslagrad 2 come primarily from the following sources. First, the scrolls are back, and now there are 81 of them. They are organized into 6 story arcs. Second, the diary, which I will explain in detail later. And finally, the newsreels. These serve the same purpose as the theaters in Teslagrad 1, in that they reiterate a few of the scroll story arcs and display the major plot points, but we'll cover each one individually. And with that, let's set the scene. Teslagrad 2 takes place in Wormheim, a region to the north of Electropia, and the home of the Vikings, who were the instigators of the barbarian invasion covered in the backstory of Teslagrad 1. Since all of this history is being told through the eyes of the victors, the Electropians, here in Wormheim, we are forced to see a skewed version of the Vikings' side of the story, which is why this first movie is entitled Bloodthirst of the Barbarians. The first scroll shows the Vikings at war with each other under the banners of 4 different clans. The infighting was stopped, and the 4 clans were unified by a man they crowned as the Serpent King. During the time of his reign, they struck oil, which led to an industrial revolution that enabled them to construct airships and become marauders. One of the victims of their conquest was the city of Teslagrad, which the Vikings plundered and brought pieces of their technology back to Wormheim. But the Vikings did not anticipate the magnitude of Electropia's response, here propagandized as Electropia's grace. We recall the king's heroic leadership back then, coupled with Teslamancer technology, which drove the Viking invasion back to their homeland. Even though the Electropians emerged victorious, their capital city was in shambles, and countless lives were lost. They weren't happy with just repelling the invasion. They now had weaponry on their side that the Vikings had no answer for. So they took to the offensive, conquering and colonizing Wormheim, enslaving the Vikings, and imprisoning their chieftain, the Serpent King. To lead the counterattack, to govern the newly annexed country, and to oversee the construction of a new Tesla tower in Wormheim, Teslagrad sent a pair of senior officials, Galvan, a Teslamancer, and Eleanor, the king's sister. The Teslamancers are obsessed with history, and for that purpose, Galvan kept a diary of his activities and observations in Wormheim. Unlike most people, however, Galvan elected to engrave his diary entries upon the walls of the region, left for the player to discover. These diary entries are the strongest source of lore in the game, and we have tried our best to accurately translate from their native Norwegian, written in Rain Games' fictional alphabet. Entry 1. I have decided to write down my memoirs during my stay in this strange country in the north. My journeys in the woods and fields will give me plenty of time to carve my thoughts into stone, so that posterity can remember this glorious period in the history of Electropia, the conquest of Wormheim. Entry 2. So, this is my new place of residence. After the king's effective intervention, the barbarians seem to settle moderately into their new existence as subjects, well deterred by the thunderclaps of our weapons. Their chieftain is in chains. The Vikings will never plunder our land again. Entry 3. Due to the distance between our new conquest and Electropia, it is deemed necessary to install a deputy for our king as a regent until the construction of a teleport line is completed. The Council of the Teslamancers, led by the able Solomon, consults with the king to find a worthy candidate. Entry 4. The king's sister and Solomon's wife, Her Majesty Eleanor, has been given the hard job of keeping these barbarians under control. As the Queen's faithful servant, I put aside my own aversion to these dirty northerners and swear to do my utmost to keep the peace up here. At this point, we can recognize that Galvan is extremely prejudiced, and therefore, as a storytelling trope, he is what they would call an unreliable narrator. Just like with the propaganda coming from Electropia, we are definitely seeing the story from Galvan's point of view. Entry 5. As unskilled and ignorant as these barbarians are, they seem to have realized the superiority of Electropian architecture during their pillaging expeditions in our kingdom. They have built themselves a small tower which is a kind of imitation of our buildings. Entry 6. The main material in the Viking tower is wood, like a child's toy, so it doesn't rise anywhere near as high as the Teslamancers' constructions. We will show them the superiority of Electropia by building a sky-high tower that will put them in its shadow. Entry 7. This barbaric country is truly rich in resources. The Vikings, however, do not seem to have the sense to use the wonderful magnetic material whose veins permeate the bedrock. They seem to appreciate more the flammable fluid they pump up from the ground. Entry 8. People back home showed great interest in these grooves that can be found up here. With minor loss of life, our Viking slaves captured some great breeding specimens, which we sent to Teslagrad for training. I love the phrase minor loss of life here, with how flippantly he treats the Vikings' lives. Really shows you what kind of person Galvan is. Entry 9. In order to show the king that his new kingdom is prosperous, we sent Faradeus to Teslagrad with a symbolic gift, a basket overflowing with the growth of the field. A mechanical bird has not yet returned, but we assume that the gift spread great joy in its home country. This entry provides context to the great mural that we see in Teslagrad 1. And one thing that I neglected to mention in the first lore video regarding Faradeus and the connection to her namesake, Michael Faraday, is that her boss fight takes place inside of one of his inventions, a Faraday cage. Entry 10. The tower's construction is progressing smoothly. Our new minions are strong and durable, so there is no shortage of manpower. Under Eleanor's wise hand, we have put the barbarians to work mining magnetic ore and raw materials. Entry 11. Telecommunication with Electropia is sporadic due to our Viking slaves' lack of understanding of the fine mechanics of a good teleporter. However, Queen Eleanor succeeds from time to time in achieving contact with our homeland. driven by the longing for her daughter, husband, and brother. Indeed, the powers of family ties are great. This entry corrects an assumption that I made in the previous video. Let's take a look at that family tree again. Eleanor's husband, as we know, is Solomon Tesla. Her brother is the king. Her daughter, then, has to be Teslakid's mother. I had previously assumed that Teslakid was related to Solomon via his father. Scroll 34 from Teslagrad 1 could be subtly confirming this by showing Solomon standing next to Teslakid's mother. And if we look at the Last Supper painting again, this girl sitting with Solomon Tesla could very well be his daughter. Entry 12. According to Her Majesty Eleanor, the king's ambitions have grown admirably as a result of the successful takeover of Wormheim. It is rumored that he wishes to expand our kingdom to also include Motorland, Angloria, and Mesmer, united under the Electric Crown. This entry connects the events happening at this point in time in Wormheim with the concurrent events happening in Electropia. It also confirms what we feared regarding the king's expansion. It wasn't about preventing Viking attacks anymore, it was a power grab. This marks the beginning of the Electropian kingdom's transition from an aristocratic city-state to the imperial dictatorship that it would eventually become. Entry 13. News from Teslagrad. Solomon's lack of support for the expansion of the kingdom has created a certain rift between Eleanor and her husband, but as her humble servant, I am prepared to offer a steady shoulder if Solomon's stupidity should lead to a breach of marriage covenants. This is starting to show Galvan's infatuation with Eleanor and his secret hope that she divorces, which is very creepy. This will also be the last time that Galvan mentions successful communication with Teslagrad. Entry 14 is out of chronological order, so I will read it when it makes sense in the timeline. Entry 15. Our Viking slaves have probably not completely given up their thieving ways. Some of my experimental weapons, which combine Viking craftsmanship with Electropian technology, have mysteriously disappeared from the laboratory. This is in reference to the magnetic hatchet, which we will see later. Entry 16. In order to strengthen the Electropian military, we have initiated a recruitment program where we train our most obedient Viking slaves for service. Combative as they are, this will probably prevent restlessness among the savages. Teleporters are not yet functional, but the long march to Teslagrad will build strength for the coming conquest. Entry 17. The construction of the tower is delayed, but we have decided to step up the mining operation and focus on providing materials for His Majesty's conquest ambitions. If we had gotten the teleporter in order, we would have had a strong supply line to the Electropian war machine. The irony of these entries is twofold. First is that we know that the king's conquest proved to be an utter failure, and that the lives of these Vikings would all be lost. Second, if the kingdom truly equipped these soldiers as shown with just a sword and cloth armor, they were better equipped as Vikings with metal helmets and shields. Using the peoples you conquered to go up against neighboring countries whose technology rivals your own shows just how foolish the king's ambition was. Motorland has tanks, Mesmer has mind control, Angloria has Lord freaking Clonington. And just for context, if you haven't played World to the West, Clonington defeats a giant Gru by punching it in the face. Nuff said. Entry 18. Recent mining operations have uncovered a curious discovery. Deep below the village there are traces of an ancient civilization, but despite sarcophagi and urns, there are no traces of human remains. Could these ugly creatures that seem to be found in every crevice and cave in this place have settled in and used the excavation site as a pantry? A funny translation note here. I translated the Norwegian word utiskene as ugly creatures, and some alternatives include monsters, horrors, and beasts. But Google Translate and a couple of other translation websites really want to translate it as the non-Germans. Feel free to interpret that however you like. Entry 19. Superstitious and simple as they are, the barbarians seem horrified by our discovery in the depths of the mine. They claim we invite witchcraft, stupidity. Despite Queen Eleanor's well-chosen admonitions and my convincing demonstrations of physical punishment, our informants have revealed a growing dissatisfaction among the Viking people. Entry 20. The excavation site had to be sealed off for now, to keep the savages at bay, but I succeeded in first getting various artifacts from the catacombs brought to the tower for closer examination. Entry 21. The urns turned out to contain some kind of strange primordial soup, seemingly lifeless, but electrical experiments revealed properties with the potential to keep a creature's spark of life present in dead flesh, but only as long as a fast current was passed through it. Entry 22. I requisitioned an impressive horned beast, fallen during our subject's hunting expeditions, and brought it back to full vigor with the help of a generator in the cavity behind the animal's heart. When I proudly showed my masterpiece to Queen Eleanor, however, I did not get the response I had hoped for. The scroll fills in the gap here. It's quite clear that Eleanor's reaction was something along the lines of, "Get that abomination of a rotting zombie moose out of my sight!" In all seriousness, this is the first suggestion that Galvan and Eleanor don't see eye to eye, that they have different values and motivations. But since this is Galvan's story, his values begin to dominate over hers. Entry 23. My experiments continue. I put the spark of life into some of the better workers who had to deal with the afterlife after mining accidents or riots, and brought them back to work. Draugs, as the savages call them, can be somewhat recalcitrant when brought back. I am working on a solution. First, there were better translations of "deal with the afterlife," but I just love how poetic that phrase sounds. Second, draug in Norwegian translates to ghost, but these are not ghosts in a fantasy sense because they are still corporeal. The game developers call them wraiths, but that also doesn't quite fit. So rather than get into a fantasy debate over what they classify as, I'm just going to call them draugs and be done with it. Entry 24. I have created a head device, developed from diagrams in a Mesmerian book, that bends the draugs to my will. The ignorant northerners are less appreciative of it, but what can they do? If they become belligerent and must be reprimanded, we will still be able to use them as draugs. As shown in Rain's other games, the nation of Mesmer specializes in mind control devices. In this room, Galvan has a diagram of his process for reviving the dead. Underground goo, magnet mineral, good old-fashioned current, Viking cadaver. That's how you make ghosts. Galvan's notes on needing a fast current explains why the devices implanted in the Draug's chests resemble inductor coils, is because that's exactly what they are. An inductor in an electrical circuit is designed to provide continuous current. So it was at this time that tensions had reached a breaking point. Galvan had gone to the dark side of Teslamancy by resurrecting the dead. Eleanor did not approve of it at all, and the Vikings were doomed to work as slaves for their entire lives, and then die, and then continue to work as slaves. They began telling horror stories, demonizing Eleanor and burning effigies of her, actions that she seemingly took to heart. The Vikings also began conspiring to perform a jailbreak. In a remote cabin at the base of the Tesla Tower, they sketched their plans. Dungeon, throne room, release the Serpent King, put an end to the tyrants, stubborn warriors, young half-tooth leads the way, strong rope with grappling hook, we're leaving here. This third movie is entitled Revenge of the Serpent King. In the middle of the night, they scaled the Tesla Tower to the Serpent King's jail cell. Broke the bars with stolen tools, provided him with the magnetic hatchet that was stolen from Galvan's lab, and armed him to lead a full-scale riot. We'll now jump directly to the fourth movie, The Great Tragedy, where the story continues, and we watch the battle between Galvan and the Serpent King unfold. Entry 25. Disaster. I have failed my queen. Driven by the superstition that Her Majesty would be a witch and necromancer, the barbarians freed their chieftain and made their way into the throne room. The king's guard tried to drive the horde back while the queen activated the teleporter, but the overwhelming power was too great. Entry 26. If only my advice to execute the chieftain on the spot when we conquered Wormheim had been followed, Queen Eleanor would still be alive. Her open-heartedness became, to my great sorrow, her bane. I feel like Galvan underestimates the Vikings quite often. While it's true that the Serpent King held great significance for the Vikings as their unifier, his death would have been a martyrdom, which could have acted as a strong unifying force by itself. And as we will soon see, there will always be someone to take the chieftain's place. Entry 27. With the blades of the horde against my throat, and in the belief that Her Majesty had made it to safety, I put a surge in my lightning gauntlet in an attempt to sacrifice my life to annihilate them all. In the last moment before the light took us from the world, to my horror, I saw that Queen Eleanor had turned back to negotiate with the barbarians. Specifically, we see that Eleanor doffs her crown, seemingly in a sign of resignation or surrender, which could be construed as a willingness to negotiate. She likely had no idea what Galvan was attempting to do. Entry 28. When the dust settled, Eleanor was lifeless, and I was on the brink of death. Some Vikings unfortunately survived, but their chieftain was dead. The ferocity of the savages was gone before long, and they crept away with their tails between their legs. I let them be, as the only thing on my mind was bringing our queen back to life. Entry 29. In order to have a chance to bring Eleanor back to her former glory, I first had to secure my own existence. I worked through the night on my own deformed body. Splintered flesh had to give way to metal and electricity. Now, I myself am kept alive by Draug technology, but I have retained my sanity. Here is a diagram of Galvan's self-described mask to protect my disfigured face. Made of ceramic, it features studs for mounting. Ouch. Entry 30. Valuable time was lost before I could bring Eleanor back. I gave her the spark of life, but the last echoes of her conscious mind seem to have given way to a directionless and furious dream state. I had to rip the teleporter for power cells to save us both, so we've lost all contact with Electropia. This diagram explains how Galvan used the parts of the teleporter. The power cells from the teleporter had to be borrowed. Arm A keeps me in a vital state. Arm B, electric heart. Despite Galvan mentioning the loss of contact, news of Eleanor's death somehow had to have made its way back to Teslagrad to cause Solomon Tesla to erect the memorial in Wintergarden. Could it be that they witnessed the final moments before the explosion? Perhaps the lack of communication afterward caused Teslagrad to assume the worst, that the northern colony was totally wiped out. Entry 31. Hoping to bring Eleanor back to her old self, I have put her to sleep in a specially developed chamber, built with materials from the teleporter. I know her mind still exists in her body, but how to bring it back to life? Now we can jump back to Entry 14. Somewhere up here in the glacier, the Vikings are supposed to have buried the remains of their chieftain. May his death serve as a warning to them all. Entry 32. The Vikings have left the valley, but they are multiplying like rats. They have built themselves a rickety structure out in the sea, where they pump their fire water as fuel for their dragon ships, and they make occasional attempts to raid the tower to kill me and free their former companions. Entry 33. They are a nuisance, these Vikings, but easy enough to defeat, with the exception of their new chieftain, a huge slob who must have been involved in the rebellion against the Queen. If nothing else, I get enough new draugs out of these distractions. The huge slob in question is Halfdan, or Halftooth, so named because of his winning smile. And he was involved in the rebellion against the Queen since he led the jailbreak. You'll notice the large facial scar he suffered in the tower explosion. And also, if you haven't already noticed, the guy is wearing a dead grue as a shawl. Our next scroll arc shows Galvan opening one of the urns of primordial soup from the catacombs and storing the liquid for use in his Draug necromancy. Later on, Entry 34. A strange thing happened. Despite the fact that the artifacts from the excavations have been untouched for a long time, life apparently sprang forth spontaneously from the liquid in one of the containers. The creature appears harmless enough, despite its similarities with grues. I am keeping it for further study until I can build a device that fits its peculiar head shape. This creature born from the primordial soup is named Huldr. In Scandinavian folklore, a Huldr or Huldra is a seductive forest creature with the tail of a cow and a hollow tree bark covered back. It could be compared to a dryad or a wood nymph in other fantasy realms, but more sinister. But like Galvan said, this creature has distinctively grue-like characteristics. In the scrolls, we see Galvan feeding her and attempting to put a mind control device on her head, but she shatters it, whereupon Galvan shackles her in a jail cell, the very same jail cell that the Serpent King was freed from. She sees the broken bars and uses a fishbone to pick the lock of her shackle and make her escape. This is the lockpicking Huldr. Now on her own, Huldr finds kinship among the grues. Entry 35. The creature that rose from the artifacts has escaped. It resisted when I tried to bring it under my will. If I see it again, the most sensible thing to do is kill it. Entry 36. Draugs are useful slaves. With their help, I have captured a gigantic serpent whose venom seems to be useful in the surface treatment of metals. Much of the tower has been rebuilt to automate and maximize resource production, which will undoubtedly help the king's conquest if I ever get the damned teleporter working. Galvan drew a couple of diagrams that provide more detail. The serpent's name is Fafnir, aquatic giant snake. Masked to control the animal's will, enormous bite force, venom glands, alchemy potential, jaw lock, serpent venom for the treatment of base metals, alchemy reaction, Gold! Finances for the king's campaign? Risk, potential for deflation. So here we discover the source of the king's vast fortune shown at the end of Teslagrad 1. They were using Fafnir's venom to transmute metal into gold. There's a recurring theme of the king's insecurity, of being a total failure in the absence of Teslamancer technology, and this is just another example of it. Even his wealth is fake. But this does raise a continuity question. If Wormheim's teleporter was still broken, then how did all of this gold get here? Entry 37. Can trolls be tamed? These enormous territorial monsters of mossy rock would be a formidable resource for the Electropian war machine. Well, let's try an experiment. Hey, Mr. Troll, can you be tamed? Results are inconclusive. Entry 38. So, this is the Viking chieftain's grave. Worm King, the savages called him. Now the only worms he has to deal with are the ones that feed on his flesh. He would make a good Draug, but I can't stand having the man who became Eleanor's bane in my sight. Here I need to point out that the Norwegian word orm can mean serpent, snake, worm, or even dragon. Galvan is using it to make a pun on the Serpent King's name. Now, I could very well have been calling him Worm King throughout, but let's face it, Serpent King is a much cooler name. Entry 39. How many years have passed since Eleanor was put to sleep? I haven't heard anything from Teslagrad for decades. Is our kingdom still in its glory days? Or has the king's march failed? Have my people been eradicated by our neighboring countries as revenge? Or are there other Teslamancers out there? Entry 40. If only I could get in touch with Electropia. After years of study, I have come to the conclusion that a transfer of mind from Eleanor's body is probably possible. However, the donor body must come from a close relative so the mind does not reject it. And now we have come to the beginning of the game. Galvan is about to have his wishes fulfilled, but first, we need to introduce our protagonist. After the events of Teslagrad 1, Tesla Kid and his mother worked to govern Teslagrad under the leadership of the Teslamancers. Tesla Kid eventually marries this girl seen in Teslagrad 1's true ending, and they have several children, one of whom is Lumina. In the beginning of World to the West, we see Lumina chasing after her father and running into her siblings, Ohm, Tjalv, and Roskva. Ignoring Ohm's directive to stay away from the teleporter, Lumina finds herself teleported to a faraway land to the west and must make her way home. After that game's conclusion, she procures an airship to sail back east. However, the Tesla tower she has been sailing towards is Wormheim's, and the Vikings, seeing a vulnerable Teslamancer, shoot her down. Entry 41. A girl dressed in Electropian attire crashed on the shore, felled by the vile savages. She seems scruffy and unkempt, so it is almost unthinkable that she would be a descendant of the Queen. But if this is a blood relation, a union of her body and Eleanor's mind will be possible. And so, he comes to see her face to face, and finds her treasured photograph of her family. After, sending a message to the Vikings pursuing her, he takes the photo back to his tower for closer inspection. Entry 42. The photo the red-haired girl lost confirms a blood relation. I have decided to take the young Teslamancer under my cloak. With the right guidance and hard physical training, her young body will become a capable vessel for Eleanor's return. And so he decides to send Lumina on a series of trials. But before he gets the chance, she unexpectedly falls into a cave and encounters Hulder, who gives chase. After Lumina makes her escape and returns to the surface, Galvan shows up to give her a map and an objective. This objective happens to be the Gru's spawning grounds, which Hulder is guarding. After Lumina defeats Hulder, Galvan then guides Lumina through the Vikings' tower to the base of the Tesla Tower, where she encounters the first Draug, the Tesla Moose. Entering the tower, Lumina passes through a multi-story forge, because every Tesla tower needs a multi-story forge, right? In the floor above, she finds the throne room, still showing the impact of the explosion. Behind that, the broken teleporter. The viewfinder activates to show Lumina's family recognizing her and then crowding the camera before Galvan shows up to deactivate it. Lumina's escape is not part of Galvan's agenda. Lumina ascends to the next level of the tower and finds its interior quite organic and scaly. Turns out this area of the tower is occupied by Fafnir, being held in chains to produce venom for Galvan's alchemy. After defeating and freeing Fafnir, she continues to climb and witnesses the beginning of a new Viking raid outside. They seem to be claiming the bodies of their fallen brethren who had been converted to Draugs. This culminates in a clash where Halvdan and his crew break in and confront Galvan. While they are distracted fighting each other, Lumina escapes along a wire to a frozen landscape, the top of the mountain where Hulder roams. The Vikings are up here too, and Lumina sees Hulder get captured and dragged off. As Lumina follows, she finds Hulder being loaded into an airship that is bound for the Vikings' offshore oil rig. On board the oil rig, with flammable obstacles and materials strewn everywhere, Lumina unwittingly starts a fire. She frees Hulder, and the two make a mad dash for safety. Grabbing a passing airship, they make it off of the oil rig before it explodes. With Hulder and Lumina each realizing that the other isn't so bad after all, they share an embrace, before Hulder urges Lumina onward. Waiting for her is Halvdan. After a brief fight, the two come crashing into the burial chamber of the Serpent King, still holding the magnetic hatchet that was taken from Galvan's lab. Halvdan admits defeat and offers the hatchet to Lumina, but this is interrupted by Galvan appearing and electrocuting Halvdan. Lumina attempts to stop him, even throwing the hatchet at him, but he brushes her off and sends her a final objective to meet him at the top of the tower, then makes his escape. Entry 43. Even though the girl made a bold attack on the Vikings' lair and sank it into the depths of the sea, she refused to deliver the coup de grace when their chieftain lay ready for the blow. But when I show her Eleanor, she will understand. Entry 44. As she is a Teslamancer of noble blood, I'm certain that Eleanor's descendant is willing to sacrifice herself for her queen and her fatherland. Electropia's day of glory awaits. Near the top of the tower, Lumina recovers her photograph, which Galvan has arranged on a family tree. Further up, she finds Eleanor in her stasis chamber. Entry 45. Betrayal. Eleanor's descendant refuses to follow my plans. She must be subdued by force. Her rebellious insolence will give way to respect when she understands what true self-sacrifice is. Queen Eleanor must be resurrected, whatever the cost. At the top of the tower, we see Galvan has painted his vision of Eleanor in Lumina's body, leading his army of Draugs. Lumina, quite obviously, doesn't agree with this, so they engage in a showdown. Once Galvan realizes he is losing, he once again tries the tactic of overloading his glove, which destroys much of the upper spire of the tower. Lumina, however, has taken one of the invincibility shields that Galvan dropped, which absorbs the blast. While Galvan attempts to charge his power, one quick ground pound from above sends the two crashing into the exposed room below, breaking Eleanor's stasis chamber. In the incomplete ending, Galvan attempts to save Eleanor by transferring his remaining spark of life into her inductor, but she remains unresponsive, causing him to collapse in despair. If, however, you collect the 4 pieces of hidden equipment, then you get the true ending. Eleanor rouses from her slumber, and is none too happy with what Galvan has done to her. However, she is still in what Galvan described as a furious dream state, and now Lumina must deal with her wrath. Once Lumina defeats her, she removes her mask, causing her to crumble into dust, leaving behind only her crown and the inductor coil that kept her unalive for so long. Lumina successfully repairs Wormheim's teleporter and sends herself back to Teslagrad, where her family is waiting. The true ending shows one extra scene. Lumina places Eleanor's crown on her memorial in Wintergarden. The queen is finally laid to rest. First of all, I love this story. We get to see the depraved atrocities of Teslamancy gone wrong. Every character shows complex motives as well as flaws, demonstrated by their actions and attitudes, giving them depth. I am blown away by the slow burn of telling this story across the span of 3 games, and I cannot wait to see what comes next. The next thing I want to talk about is the passage of time and the continuity of characters' ages. The timeline we have come up with spans a few generations, and the artwork has done a great job of portraying the characters at different ages along the way, so these clues can help us hypothesize how many years passed between major events. Starting from the Last Supper painting, assumedly captured when Galvan and Eleanor were about to depart for Wormheim, if this girl sitting with Solomon Tesla is his daughter, I'm going to put her around 3 to 6 years old. From the beginning of the Wormheim offensive to the Teslamancer genocide, I'm going to give around 15 to 20 years, long enough for Solomon's daughter to mature, marry, and give birth to Tesla Kid. From the beginning of the Teslamancer genocide to the beginning of Teslagrad 1, we look at Tesla Kid's age as the game begins. I'm going to say he's around 8 to 10 years old. From the end of Teslagrad 1 to the beginning of World to the West, Tesla Kid needs enough time to mature, marry, and have Ohm, his oldest child, be somewhere around 16 to 18 years old, and Lumina to be 15. A member of the dev team confirms this time span is 25 to 30 years. From the beginning of World to the West to the beginning of Teslagrad 2, I would say there is a negligible time difference, a matter of days. So, from the Last Supper painting to the beginning of Teslagrad 2, Galvan and Eleanor have been in Wormheim for a total of around 48 to 60 years. I believe that Eleanor died before the Teslamancer genocide began, because I believe that her death served as a catalyst for causing that schism, my rationale being that Solomon and the king were both in grief, while also aggrieved at each other over the failed conquest, and it's a lot easier to make irrational accusations and assumptions when someone is dead. So that means that Galvan and Eleanor have been undead longer than Teslakid has been alive, more than 33 years, and possibly more than 40 years. Time flies when you're dead. So now, transitioning from the stories that are told to the stories that are untold. I feel like the most underrated plot element in Teslagrad 2 is the broken line of communication with Teslagrad. How would Galvan have reacted, for example, if he had learned of the king initiating the Teslamancer genocide? Or if he had learned of the king being overthrown? He had his suspicions, but I think he was afraid to discover the truth. What would have happened if he had gotten the teleporter working and sent himself and his Draug army to Teslagrad? It is his ironic ignorance of these events and his devotion to carry on as regent of a kingdom that has ceased to exist, which makes his story that much more tragic. And what were Eleanor's motives during all of this? We hardly know anything about her, and Galvan's biased storytelling merely projects his quest for glory upon her. How much of that ambition was his, and how much of it was genuinely hers? From reading over these diary entries, it did seem that she initially matched his thirst for conquest, but then began to have second thoughts once he started experimenting with raising the dead. But after having those second thoughts, it seems like she just gave up and let Galvan run the show for the most part, and let herself become a figurehead instead of a leader. When the Vikings began burning effigies of her, I feel she began to empathize with their mistreatment and feel their humanity. When the Serpent King and Galvan were fighting to the death in her throne room, it felt like she had had enough, and she was finally siding with the Vikings in this conflict. But it was too late. Explosion. The aftermath was yet another tragedy. Galvan was working so hard to restore Eleanor as leader when she had lost interest in leadership, and he had been doing all of the leading all along. I think he was deceiving himself. He didn't care about her leadership. He wanted to bring her back because he loved her. Finally, the one major thing left unanswered is the origin of the primordial soup. If we explore the catacomb that Galvan described, we see a very alien series of pictograms written on the walls. Whatever made these has awareness and intelligence, as it shows humanoid forms interacting with the ooze, creatures spawning from it, and the humans interring it into urns. Since it appears that everything spawning from this liquid takes on a resemblance to grues, it would make sense to presume that this substance is the origin of the grues themselves. At the end of this catacomb, a very long serpent-like creature is depicted, which suggests Fafnir also originated here. And for the Serpent King to gain his title, he must have had some sort of personal connection with Fafnir. In a couple of other places in the game, we can see other Gru-like creatures which seemingly also arose from this goop. Why is it here? What is it really? Where did it come from? What knowledge do the Vikings have of it that Galvan refused to hear? And here's a wild idea. Could Hulder be the spirit of Eleanor reborn? Some of these questions I'm sure will be answered in one of Rain's next adventures. This adventure, however, has come to an end. Thank you all for watching.